Black is beautiful. Yes, it is. Black is beautiful. Black is beautiful.
No justice, no peace. I'm Kalia.
I'm Alana.
I'm Donnie.
And I'm Kennedy.
And welcome to The Take. So I'm sure you are wondering what's up this week. Well, today's episode is part 2 of our campaign for justice. In last week's episode, we created a space to discuss the relationship between DPD and Black people with an interview with Chief Payson. It was during this episode when we decided it was necessary to address how the police have historically interacted with the Black community. It is necessary to provide and discuss this history so our listeners will have more of an understanding of the contentious relationship we have. This is our take on the history of the police and the Black community. Before we begin, let's take some highlights from our last. Donnie, Alana, and Kennedy, what did you take away from our conversation with Chief Payson?
What I took away from the conversation with Chief Payson was him talking about how much he wants to include equity within his department.
I took away how police officers are getting new trainings to include sensitivity training.
What he is doing to make sure deaths like George Floyd don't happen anymore.
I appreciate being able to actually see how DPA have addressed some of the issues that as Black people disadvantage us on a regular basis. And we also had Mr. Murdock and Mr. Hawkins co-host the podcast with us. Mr. Murdock and Mr. Hawkins, what were some of your takeaways from our conversation?
I'll start by saying I feel like Chief Payson seemed very authentic, and I really appreciated that from him. Hawkins?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Murdock. I also want to say that I felt that Chief Payson was authentic, and I want to echo about the training. I think that the training is huge, and if we're going to combat the tough relationship that we've had with police departments and Black people in America, the training is going to be very important. I also agree that he seemed that he was very focused on equity, and I like his history. He comes from a community of people of color. He has, I'm sure, himself witnessed some of those things growing up, and he was in the Marine Corps. And being a Marine myself, I know that there's a lot of things that we're up against as people of color in the military. So I appreciate where Chief Payson was coming from.
Thank you for that. And just to get into today's conversation, today the podcast will be all of us discussing our take on the history of the police and the Black community and how this is still relevant in 2021.
Before we get started, we must remind our listeners of our trigger alert. Donnie, can you please read the trigger alert?
If you are not 110% in support of Black Lives Matter, please dismiss yourself. If you are in any sort of agreement with the systematic oppressions this country has inflicted on minorities, once again, please dismiss yourself. And if you're not willing to give every bit of the power that the people so undeniably deserve, then please dismiss yourself. Because in a few moments, you'll witness vast amounts of Black engagement. And if you do not dismiss yourself, then the thoughts, facts, and feelings we're about to share will most definitely dismiss you.
This is the history of the police and how it's interacted with and affected the Black community.
Our people were brought over in chains and are still in chains. Programming is programming.
So the history of policing starts during slavery in the mid-1600s. Did you know that the first police services began as night watchers?
Yeah, the slave patrols gave white Americans to stop to question and search any Black person who was walking around to ensure that enslaved people were not escaping or going places they weren't supposed to be.
That's right, Kennedy. They began in order to hold disorders, not crimes. I know that one of the first watch groups was the Boston Neighborhood Watch Group in the 1600s. They even had laws that was made exclusively for white men between the ages of 21 and 45.
They were required to serve on these night watches.
Exactly. This means that the majority of the men serving in these groups did not have to meet any specific requirements or expectations. In fact, sometimes they would put criminals on watch.
I don't know about y'all, but understanding more of the duties of night watchers makes me see how far back police brutality goes in this country and that it still happens today.
Yeah, thinking about the night watchers makes me think I'm going to draw the past and into the future or the present time, I mean. Thinking of night watchers makes me think about Trayvon Martin. he was murdered by a modern day night watcher. And this is, for this to still happen in America is no good. We've changed the names, we've changed the decades, we've changed the centuries, but we keep the same mentality. And we really need to work on that.
And it brings to mind for me the racist norms that were and have been intentionally established to order, scare, threaten, and attack, and even at times kill any non-white, specifically Black and originally ex-slaves. The manner in which Derek Chauvin calmly, for 10 minutes, kneeled on the neck of George Floyd showed how normal it was for him, as well as the other officers who witnessed this crime. We have to all think, how many other officers in law enforcement agencies are the legacy of night watchers, slave catchers still present and or active and alive in to this day?
Obviously, these night watch groups and patrols existed all throughout slavery, and the states that they resided in determined how they would interact with the Black people that lived there. Did y'all know, in the North, as states and cities began to urbanize and grow, these small night watch groups began to grow into fully developed policing systems? Philly created the first day watch in 1833.
Yeah, one of the first full-time on-duty police forces in the U.S. was in Boston in 1838, and then New York actually followed in 1844.
While slavery wasn't active in the North, that doesn't mean that these growing police forces didn't play a part in discriminating and endangering freed or escaped slaves from the South. And soon in the 1880s, all major U.S. cities had police systems in place.
In the South, policing looked very different. They existed for the sole purpose of 1, chasing runaway slaves back to their owners, 2, providing organized fear to deter slave revolts, and 3, maintaining a form of discipline to make sure that slaves abided by plantation rules.
Basically, the night watch groups throughout the South were slave patrols who enforced laws that keep the Black people enslaved.
I just want to know, what resonates with y'all knowing that these night watch groups were the traditional role of policing that converted directly into police departments today?
What resonates with me is how policing began not to protect and serve, but to enforce unjust laws and to promote fear of not following those laws, allowing for any white man to inflict punishment, severe bodily harm, and as we know, violent deaths, if a Black person was assumed to be defiant, non-compliant, learning anything that they didn't want them to learn, or outside of their boundaries, or falsely suspected or confirmed as harboring or assisting other Blacks or slaves in any of the ways that I've just described. This way was widely accepted and promoted to do to Blacks and slaves, not only as punishments, but as preventions, meaning a white man could often beat, emasculate, kill, and lynch any Black man they saw fit as a punishment for any crime or breaking their law or their order. And it also meant that these tactics could be used at any time to deter or prevent Blacks or slaves from thinking about defying their way of life or their laws.
Now, we already addressed the identity and purpose of these slave catchers, but did y'all know that they were also responsible for a good amount of the lynchings at the time? Like how police have followed no-knock rules used when they suspect someone of having drugs or doing something illegal. They could forcefully enter anyone's home if they were suspected of harboring slaves. This normalized behavior of violating the homes of Black people for simply living once again reminds me of situations like Keontae Neely, who was literally just sleeping in her home and had her space and life disrespected by the police.
Yeah, that's very true. For as long as we've been here, Black people have been seen as second-class citizens. We've been disrespected by the laws, the lawmakers, the law enforcers, and things of that nature. We talk a lot about Breonna Taylor because it's more recent, but there's also Fred Hammond, who was killed while he was sleeping. And what was he guilty of? Uniting people of color. He brought together people from the same social class, Blacks and whites alike, to develop unity and resist the treatment that we were receiving from the police. And he was murdered for that. This continues to happen now. It is modern day lynching. I want to add, it might not be the necessarily the training that they receive, but it's definitely in the culture of the police departments that this continues to happen.
Exactly. And speaking of the police, going back to slavery a little bit, on top of all of the slave catchers, Southern states had systemic ways that were made to make freedom increasingly impossible for Black people.
They actually created slave codes, which were laws passed in the Southern states to keep enslaved Black people from running away or rebelling. The codes were different from state to state, but they mostly followed the lines of extremely restricting the human rights of Black people.
Some of these slave codes included: 1, slaves could not gather in groups of 3 or more. Even when they were at church, they were still had to be supervised by a white person on their plantation. 2, slaves could not leave their owner's premises without written permission. 3, slaves could not own firearms. 4, they weren't allowed to learn to read or write. 5, slaves could not own land. 6, they could not possess inflammatory literature, which at the time really meant any book besides the Bible. And 7, slave owners could physically punish their slaves.
After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, Southern states continued to implement and enforce laws that would discriminate and disregard the rights of Black people. Once again, the Black codes varied from state to state, but followed a similar outline to the slavery codes. Some of the codes were: 1, interracial marriage was still not allowed. 2, segregation of public spaces and facilities. 3, free people over the age of 18 were required to work and could be imprisoned or forced to work under a contract. 4, slavery codes 1 and 4. 5, freed Black people could not vote. And 6, Black people could not own property.
Even though they're not called slave and Black codes anymore, do you still see that connection to how laws are created to disproportionately target Black people?
I remember learning about Jim Crow laws in Miss Roberts' class while we were reading Stamp by Jason Reynolds, how those laws were created to keep Black and white people apart. There were also laws that made it hard for Black people to even vote.
When there are laws made to target something or someone, there are officers who are there to enforce them. It's undeniable that many white police officers during Reconstruction took their positions policing Black people almost too seriously. Following the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan in 1915, founder William J. Simmons openly advocated for white supremacy, but also stated that there were KKK members in every level of law enforcement, and that the local sheriff was often the first one in town to join the Klan. When the police sheriffs were KKK members, it made it 10 times easier for Black citizens to be targeted for crime and punishment with little to no evidence or due justice, almost always ending in being ran out of town, beaten, or lynched. With examples of racist and or white supremacist officers across the country, it's not a stretch to say that there are still some officers out there in the Klan and other white supremacist organizations. Now, we know that an officer cannot be part of an organization like the KKK and be impartial to or even fair to Black citizens. In your opinion, do you think that the personal connections an officer has off duty can affect how they serve and protect different people?
I would say yes. I absolutely think that that affiliations that police officers have while off duty are play into the way that they do their policing. Let's just take this into consideration. We're all human beings. And if we do something positive, like if we go to a motivational type of conference that tells us about leadership and things of that nature, we walk out and we feel empowered. We understand things a little bit better. If we go to church, if that's what you do, you develop better morals. Well, let's think about the police officer that murdered Philando Castile. He attended the bulletproof warrior training, which it's a fear-based training. And he had attended that prior to killing Mr. Castile. And, I brought him up earlier, and I think it's important that those types of places are not allowed to be, officers are not allowed to be a part of that, while they're actual police officers, even during their off duty. It's just not beneficial to those that they are serving, and it helps develop those implicit biases. So, no, I don't think that they should be able to just join any group that they want to.
I agree. Very similar to any time that you hear about a police-involved shooting, let alone murder or somebody dying by the hands of a police officer or something of that nature, the first thing that happens is they put on the news, well, they were affiliated with this, or they may have been they may have been under the influence of drugs in their system, or they're a former gang member, or they're ex-convict. All of these things that they do outside of the person they were during that circumstance of getting arrested or falling into that situation with the police officers come into play immediately to justify that they were below average person or not a reliable source because they came from this background. I think this fair shake to do with anybody that's in a position of power, let alone law enforcement.
I completely agree with what both of you guys just said. And just to flip it a little bit, would you say that it's the responsibility of other officers or the good guys to report their fellow officers when they're a part of something like the KKK that jeopardizes their quality of their work?
I feel like that is a major problem. We all know that there's racists within just about any entity or organization, let alone law enforcement or government agencies. We're clear that there are racists involved in play in those places. I feel like a big, huge problem is the people that know what's going on and turn the other way. A lot of times that's because of their fear from backlash of their fellow officers or unions or people that are going to have their back if they say and speak up about something that they saw that was not right. I saw an interview just yesterday on the news. I can't exactly remember what it was I was watching, but there was an interview of a police officer that said other police officers don't tell on other police officers. And I think that's a major problem of why it's been able to last and continue as long as it has.
I'd just like to add into that. I agree with what you're saying on it. And Donnie, I believe it was you at the beginning of this podcast said that culture eats policy. And it does. And we have to do much better in holding each other accountable. And that's only going to begin when these law enforcement organizations begin to respect Black lives.
I'm glad you said that. I also think that it actually is very important that if you see a police officer doing bad, if you're on duty and your partner is doing a bad job or he's targeting someone or racial profiling someone, you should speak out about it and you should be like, hey, this is not okay. You need to get this together and let people of higher standards know that what he's doing is not okay and let them know what he's doing. It's really good to be able to communicate on that level. But since I did kind of mention a little bit about racial profiling, I know one of the most prevalent and controversial reasons why Black people are targeted for arrest by police officers is because of racial profiling. The use of race or ethnicity as grounds for suspecting someone of having committed an offense, racial profiling also exists in many different forms, such as pulling over someone who looks like they don't belong in certain neighborhoods, also called driving while Black, and the stop and frisk practice being questioned today, and targeting people for arrests based off of their skin color. In cases of police brutality, simple procedures like questioning or pulling someone over can quickly become life-threatening for Black people, ending in violence based off of other unreasonable suspicion and profiling of the officer in the situation. A lot of officers come to force with pre-existing biases that can greatly affect how they interact with Black people and if they treat them fairly, with respect and dignity.
Hawkins and Murdock, as Black men, have you ever experienced racial profiling?
Yes, absolutely. And before I tell you my story about that, I just want to say something really quick. Across the nation, when kids turn 15 years old, they celebrate that they get their driver's permit. And then when they turn 16 or so, they celebrate that they get their driver's license. For parents of Black boys and Black girls, it is our time to start having a conversation with our young men and young women about how to respond to being pulled over by the police. And so that is something a lot of people don't take into consideration. And a lot of people have not had to have those conversations with their own children. But to answer your question, have I ever been a victim of profiling? And I would say yes. Here where we live in Denver, we have an affluent area called Stapleton, named after one of our former mayors who coincidentally was a Klansman. And the houses over there are $1 million plus. Well, I was driving over there and I was pulled over for not using my blinker or not coming to a complete stop. I can't remember exactly which one it was because I was so frustrated. But when I got pulled over, I knew that I had not done what I was accused of doing. But I complied because I had been taught to comply. Hey, they're just going to pull your license or whatever the case may be. I didn't have any problems, so I wasn't too worried. Well, when the officer came to me and I asked him why, and he told me his made up story and took my driver's license and all that, when he came back, by the time he came back, there was 4 police cars. And so I mentioned, I said, so I was pulled over for not using my blinker or stopping, but we have 4 police cars out here. And then he tells me, I'm a black man with relatively no hair. And he tells me we were looking for a lady with long hair and a blue hat on or something to that effect. And just hands me back my license like, now shut up and go on. And I've got to tell you that I pulled over and I was so upset. I almost cried. I'm going to go ahead and admit it. I almost cried. I was so frustrated. But the tears were not going to come from a place of fear. It was completely a place of frustration. And I don't want anybody to have to experience that. You're really getting bullied. And as a dean in schools, I don't play with bully. I don't play with bullies. So that's my experience in it. Mr. Murdock, how about you?
Yeah, this one's a little bit of a touchy situation for me. Not only did I experience the same racial profiling that you just described, Mr. Hawkins, I remember 15, 16 years old, getting a ticket because I didn't turn my signal on within 100 feet. Getting a ticket for switching lanes without properly turning on my signal, which you see people committing these situations every day. But me and my friends and the people I grew up in my neighborhood experienced this more often, the by the book technicalities that we would be held to that other drivers would not. So I figured that kind of stuff was pretty much norm. I grew up in a moderate to small city of Wichita, Kansas. We're not a huge metropolitan city. Back in those days, we're getting a little bit bigger now. But back then, it was a lot easier for the people on our side of town to be treated unfairly and racial profiled for just driving a nice car or a car with rims on it or a car with, new candy paint that we used to think was the stuff back in the day. But what is so personal to me is when I went to college. I went to college in a small town of Independence, Kansas, played football. Closing the end of my freshman year, me and about 30 of my college mates went to a little get together, or what they used to call keg parties, out on a dirt road. Me being naive, so to speak, to my surroundings, I was one of 4 or 5 Black people in a crowd of about 30 altogether, the rest being non-Black or non-people of color. All of a sudden, 3 or 4 sheriff cars pull up. Nobody on this road was aware of what was going on. As soon as the sheriffs got out the car, they immediately came over to the group that I was in that included me and the other 3 to 4 Black kids that were out there. I immediately was slammed into the mud, very similar to what happened to George Floyd. Never really brought up these thoughts and emotions until the last year of what we've been seeing in the society. But after about 2 minutes of laying in wet, like extremely wet mud, not just, a little moist mud, like mud that gets into everywhere when you're dumped into it. Couldn't breathe. It was in my nose, my mouth. After about 2 minutes of this officer on my back, he let me up, as well as a friend of mine that was on the football team, and explained that they had a call of an argument or a fight that took place out here on this road. Now, when we first arrived there were 3 white males on our football team that got in an argument. No fists, no punches, no pushes, nothing. They got into a very loud verbal argument. But instead of the police arriving and asking everybody on scene what was going on, they immediately approached me and the other Black people that were there. And as a result, 20 years later, I think back, I could have died on that road. I could have died with my face in that mud, simply because I was one of the only Black people standing out there on that road. So it led me through my 20s all the way up until present of having a big distaste of police. and law enforcement agencies. One of my good friends, Officer Cruz, I just had a conversation with him this morning. He is one of 3 officers, Officer Cruz, Officer Parker, and Officer Keith, that was here between those 2, of which I've ever had a personal relationship with and a cool conversation with, outside of them asking me what my name and what I was doing, where I was going. So that racial profiling set the tone for me to kind of never interact with police on that manner. So I'm glad that we're starting to have these conversations and starting to realize police are human beings, but at the same time, they have to realize what has caused us to feel the way that we feel from these situations.
Well, I'd just like to thank both of you guys for sharing your experiences. I think they're so important because a lot of the times, either on the TV or in the news, we hear of instances of police brutality, but we never really witnessed it if you never really know anybody. And I think especially from secondhand trauma, having seen things like George Floyd, it's very, very serious. So I appreciate you guys giving us your experiences. And obviously with these officers in these scenarios, they had pre-existing biases, probably racist ones. And I just want to ask, do you think there should be a system that sees if officers have pre-existing biases that could put them in a situation of unfair racial profiling, like with the 2 of you in your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I'm huge on training. So I think that this needs to be something that's constantly dealt with prior to anybody coming on the force. I'm sure that they have some different type of psychological testing that they do. I would be curious as to how deep it goes into the racial realm of policing. But I absolutely think that that should be a disqualifier if a person has a history of that type of thing, or of racial biases, or if they have involvement in some of these groups that promote that type of belief. I think that they should be excluded from the being a candidate of the police department.
I agree. Same, likewise. I think there just needs to be a more rigorous training process, as well as background check when it comes to people's ties and mental health. And I would even say family ties, going as deep as researching and finding out if a person that is applying to be a police officer, if his father was or grandfather was a slave owner or a KKK member or something relevant from a racist systematic situation. I think those should be held or brought up as well for anybody applying for those type of positions.
I completely agree. And just to jump a little bit into the future, if you haven't caught the pattern already, the police over time have always played a role in the enslavement and policing of Black people. Even after slavery was abolished, there have always been coincidentally convenient ways Black people have been imprisoned and legally enslaved in this country. This includes being unemployed, attempting to vote, learn, own land, and exercise our First Amendment right. The topic of mass incarceration began to fully develop during the war on drugs during the 60s and 70s. After Nixon had declared the war on drugs, Black men in particular were targeted, arrested, harshly sentenced, and imprisoned by the masses. 2 years later, President Reagan made the war on drugs an official order, which ramped up how the public and racist white people perceived it. The war on drugs gave a minimum five years sentence for people caught with 5 grams of crack. At the time, crack was mostly smoked and sold by Black people. On the other hand, to receive the same 5-year minimum sentence, you had to be caught with 500 grams of powder cocaine, mostly sold and used by rich and white people.
Let that sink in. It's not rocket science, it's racism.
Exactly. And not even to mention that the punishments for Black and white drug offenders were visibly different. The war on drugs was never truly a war on drugs. It was a war on the Black community who were so systemically and socially displaced that many could only get by through drug dealing, not even getting into how sometimes the police and government officials will intentionally place drugs on Black people without their knowledge. Hawkins, Murdock, what do you think about the war on drugs, or Nancy Reagan's slogan, just say no to drugs?
Wow. I'm going to go ahead and date myself a little bit and say that I remember Nancy Reagan and her Just Say No campaign. And you hit the nail on the head, Clea, when you said that it wasn't a war on drugs. It was a war on our people. It was a dog whistle You can study that. We're not making this up. You can find out about this. But it was a perfect example of systemic racism. I don't know if there's a better example that I can immediately think of than this war on drugs. It was designed to continually feed Black people and other people of color into this pipeline. We refer to it as a school to jail pipeline because it starts so young, but the pipeline continues even beyond the school age. And it was feeding those privatized prison systems to continue with the modern day slavery, with mandatory minimums and unequal enforcement of laws, like you just mentioned, with the 5 grams of crack cocaine versus 500 grams of regular cocaine. It was set up against us. We could not win in any way, shape, or form. Consider that we've had dirty judges, we've had dirty cops that are planting drugs on people, and it's all just to go ahead and put people in the system. And it plays into the narrative, of Black people being criminals. We take a look at what we see on television, people lined up in chains to go to jail for crimes that they've been framed on or has just been a result of trying to feed their families. As you said a second ago, sometimes you're dealing drugs to try and feed their family. So it's very, it's terrible that that's happened. And think of the results of all of that, how it has destroyed or continued to destroy our communities. Broken homes have started all the way back during the times that we were enslaved, and we continue to break up homes through these unjust and systemically racist laws like this one here.
So what I think about the war on drugs, or Nancy Reagan's slogan, it was not a war on drugs. I think it would have been more, it would have been better to describe it as a war of drugs, because if it was a war on drugs, then they would have been attacking the sources and how the drugs were getting here and how to prevent it from getting into neighborhoods and communities, which they did not. The U.S. government supplied wars in Central American countries with military-type weapons, vehicles, gears, and money, which we received a typical payment for those supply of drugs, specifically cocaine and heroin, which are some of the most addictive and dangerous drugs that we know about. And they were heavily supplied to low-income areas and people of color who did not have means or resources to break the cycle of addiction or attend rehabilitation facilities or rehab programs. And as far as the Just Say No on drugs campaign, like Hawkins said, I remember being a young man and being in school and seeing these commercials and seeing that campaign, and seemed like every day after, one of my favorite cartoons, one of those commercials would come on. And the slogan and the actual campaign itself was created to an obvious addiction to cocaine, and specifically crack cocaine and heroin. But since those addictions began to reach outside of those low-income areas and ghettos is when it became a problem, and when Nancy Reagan and Ronald Reagan began to address it with the saying, just say no. So if we are all intelligent people here and able to realize, just say no means and implies that you have not tried or you have not used those drugs yet. All right. So if you have clear mind and able to have somebody support you, you can just say no to something you have not tried. But when they came out with this slogan and campaign, it was already described as a pandemic. This is going on in our country. This is attacking our youth. It is destroying communities. It is already there. So nothing about the Just Say No campaign said, and let's reach out to those that have problems, that we can help with addictions, that we can give these means and resources to change some of the behaviors and things that they're experiencing due to their addiction. But if you went to celebrities and high income and white communities, these things were accessible like that. If young Johnny, a white kid, came home to his mother or father addicted to cocaine, they immediately found a rehab or some kind of way to get him counseling therapy. So that Just Say No crap didn't play into the people that really needed it. So it gave white America, similar to some of the claims that Trump did as far as propaganda and putting stuff in people's head, that these people, if they're already on it, if they're already addicted, they're disposable. We can't do anything with them. They're a waste. So that in turn turned into the zero tolerance, the mandated sentencing laws that they inflicted. If you get caught with a small amount of cocaine, just a little bit, and we know this is probably your personal use, we can give you 3, 5, and maybe even upwards of 10 years. But if a white or somebody got caught with a big bag of cocaine, which was 10 times the size of those little pieces of crack cocaine that this Black person was caught with, they have the ability of getting rehabilitation, probation, don't do it again, diversion programs, and anything that they can put in place to help their young people or people that were addicted get back into society. But the opposite for low-income and Black communities was throw them in jail. They're wasted. There's no reason in trying to save them. If it happens again, give them the 3-strike law, put them in jail for the rest of their life. So I think, those things, again, were propaganda kind of to get Reagan more votes and to keep him in office rather than to actually help the American people.
Can I jump in and just add to that, Mr. Murdock? I agree with what you're saying wholeheartedly. And I want to emphasize a point that you were making is the way that it's been handled. They made it a crime to be addicted to something back then. And now with the opioid epidemic going on, now everybody wants to be treated for it. They're not being, incarcerated in large numbers like we were back in the day, because it's the other side of the coin. It's not the neighborhoods that everybody wants to think are ghetto and things of that nature. It's the neighborhoods where they expect their kids to go to college and be productive citizens. Well, we have the same expectations for our family. We're just up against a whole lot. And that's why I say this is a perfect example of systemic racism. I can't think of a better one. I really cannot.
Right. And that shifted. I grew up in an area where it was very, unfortunately, drug infested, crack cocaine to be specific. And I remember it being a time when most of the people that were going through there that were looking very addicted to drugs and down and out on their luck looked like me. Within a period of a year to 2 years, you start seeing people pull up in Mercedes Benzes, getting out in full suits, sometimes getting out in doctor scrubs, buying the same product and drugs that the people in my neighborhood had been buying for years. So once it got to that point is when I feel like the country and Ronald Reagan, now that these high society and other people are getting addicted to crack cocaine, we got to just say no. We got to put a war out on drugs. And they were the ones that were putting it in our neighborhoods.
Exactly. I don't really know why I could add on to that. Y'all really hit the nail on the head. And just like to even speak of something else, even after multiple states have legalized marijuana today, there are still Black people in prison from years and decades ago for selling and being in possession of it during the racist war on drugs and in recent years. And obviously, police have played a big part in this injustice, being the ones arresting and sometimes framing these people in the first place. Racial profiling on behalf of the police was an undeniable factor in the surge of Black arrests during the war on drugs. In fact, decades later, Nixon advisor John Ehrlichman said on record, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the Vietnam War or Black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities," Ehrlichman said. "We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." Hearing this quote from Ehrlichman and knowing what you know about the war on drugs, do you think that this legacy of policing drugs within the Black community still exists today? And if so, how?
Yes, I do. I mean, strongly do, I should say. This has been used over and over again for years to criminalize victims, suspected criminals, that are speaking up of how they were arrested or how they were approached by police officers, and was most recently used by Trump and his administration in certain areas to promote propaganda. I think if they could, if they can make it seem as if you use, sell, possess drugs, you are disposable, non-trustworthy, or unreliable, I think it goes a lot further for them in the position of justifying why they were able to feel threatened, why they were able to display or discharge their firearm, and society accepts it. The more that you put in the news, it kind of goes back to something that's probably a little bit more relevant for you as young people on this podcast. You know, as Black people, we all know like world star, what that means when somebody says world star. That means that they're going to put up fights and all the negativity. Things like that is what white America enjoys us doing. So when people that aren't too familiar with us, that don't get to interact with Black people, let alone low-income Black people and people that are struggling, their only acknowledgement is what they see on World Star, what they see on Facebook, what they see of the arguments, the fights, the disagreements. So I feel like that is something that's been in place way before TV, internet, smartphones, as far as propaganda, but it's continuously used. So again, high society and people that don't have to interact in those neighborhoods can reference and agree with those situations when we're dealt the unjust hand of the law or brutality from, you know, KKK or racist organizations and different things like that.
I completely agree. And just to shift gears a little bit, the United States has been the leader in mass incarceration for decades. Specifically, Latino and Black men are the most disproportionately represented populations in prisons here. Black people make up 13% of the U.S. population, but make up 38.6% of federal prisons to date, while white people make up 60% of the U.S. population, make up 57.6%. 1 in 3 Black boys, 1 in 6 Latino boys, and 1 in 17 white boys are expected to go to jail at one point in their life. Mass incarceration in general is a loaded topic that has deep roots in slavery and is genuinely modern-day slavery. When you target and arrest Black people disproportionately, give them harsh sentences to keep them in jail longer, take away their right to vote after they've been released, and make it nearly impossible for them to get a job or a way to support themselves, it reinforces the idea that Black men are destined to go to prison and that their freedoms and futures do not matter to the criminal justice system, historically and to date.
Firstly, police brutality has been a continuous experience within the Black community, no matter who the police are, since we've been brought to this country. From the night watchers and slave catchers of the 16 and 1800s to the KKK affiliated sheriffs to the late 1800s and early 1900s, to one too many corrupt officers today who take advantage of the controversial loopholes that continuously target and endanger Black citizens every day. Looking at these pictures of police brutality over decades, do you think anything has changed? If so, how?
I will say absolutely not. Not for the better. Believe it or not, there's some people that think that we as people of color, Black people, we are making this stuff up, or we're overreacting, or we're crying wolf. The one thing that has changed has really been now it's on video so much more. We all have cell phones in our pocket. And so now the world is getting to see what we that were raised in Black communities have seen for a lifetime. It just really puts it to the front. But are they treating us any differently? I would love to say yes, but they're not. There's some great police officers out there. You all have mentioned Officer Cruz quite often on here, and some of our other SROs. And a lot of those guys really came onto the police force to help make changes in the way police are treating people in our community. But the needle has shifted slightly. I commend them for their efforts, but this is something that is going to really take a lot of time to undo, because we have got to change the mindset of those that are hired to protect us and serve us as police officers.
I would have to second that as well, Mr. Hawkins. I don't believe it's changed, but a smidge. You know, it's changed a little bit. I will say that smidge of change was here recently when Derek Chauvin was found guilty of the murder of George Floyd. I'm not satisfied in saying that we've reached where we need to because of that decision, but I do feel like there is enough change and enough statement in that to spread to some of the other DAs and other small counties of predominantly white or even systematic racism, where they just felt like there's no way that if somebody attempts to prosecute one of our police officers that we can hold them liable because the rest of the country doesn't. So now I feel like that little small change has kind of set the tone for some of those advocates of other races that were on the fence of wanting to turn into communities and counties of change and betterment for all people, that it is possible to hold people accountable and prosecute police in situations that we know that they made a mistake or that they had committed a crime. So overall, do I think the change has been made? No, but there is a start to it. And I believe, based off of what you ladies, again, I've said this several times, you ladies are doing here on this podcast at DMLK, the resolution changes in Denver public schools, it is the start to the needle changing for us. So thank you again, ladies, for continuing to push for that change. We're not there yet, but we're getting there.
Thank you. And I agree with what both of you guys have said so far. I just want to get a little bit more into current day situations. Speaking of Black Lives Matter, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement receiving more attention in recent years, similar to the All Lives Matter movement, people responded with the Blue Lives Matter movement, mainly consisting of people who are either in denial of or openly against the Black Lives Matter movement. These people try to argue that the lives of police officers matter too. In response to this, of course they do. Nobody said that they didn't. Just like All Lives Matter, these are empty movements that are purely born out of opposition to a movement resulting from an actual problem. The Blue Lives Matter movement makes it seem like police lives are endangered in the same way as Black lives. However, police get to choose to be a cop. Becoming a police officer is literally agreeing to deal with and put yourself in harm's way to protect other people. Unfortunately, the Black Lives Matter movement was born in the first place because of police brutality and shootings of Black citizens by majorly white officers for irrational reasons. Black people don't get to choose to be Black and seen as a threat by racist police officers. The Blue Lives Matter movement essentially tries to victimize the police as if they face some type of oppression and attempts to draw attention away from and opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement, an actual issue. Blue Lives Matter is not a pro-cop movement, it's an anti-Black movement. These movements are formed with racism and hatred.
I know that in my house, I'm not allowed to say the word hate. My grandmother and mom taught me that hate is a strong word, and no matter what, we should never hate people.
Black people know that all police are not racist or bad. For example, any student that has attended DMLK knows Officer Cruz and his encounters with each of us have always been caring, educational, and even fun. We are aware that all cops aren't bad, but at the same time, the culture of police departments remains biased and racist. There are good officers, but there are more than enough bad officers to the point where it's a serious issue.
This stereotype of Black people's relationships with the police does more harm than good. However, we have to look at why so many Black people have this belief to the point where it's a stereotype and look into where it's actually valid for a lot of people.
And Mr. Hawkins, you mentioned this earlier, that students around my age are starting to receive their permit and their license. And I actually just received my permit. But if I ever happen to be pulled over, I want to be able to reach for my wallet, unlock my door, and even reach for my registration and insurance without the fear that that will be the moment where I take my last breath. I want to lay in my bed at night and sleep peacefully without wondering if my life will even be taken.
We should be able to, but we can't because some people thought patrolled for slaves.
And use lynching as a tool of intimidation, even though Black people have been policed this way since slavery and America has been slow to change. Perfect example is the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act just got into Congress, but has not yet passed through the Senate. As Dr. King said during his speech at the March on Washington, we can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality.
I know we all have a similar opinion when it comes to Blue Lives Matter, but I want to ask, what do you think about the officer who openly or secretly supported the Blue Lives Matter as opposed to Black Lives Matter?
Well, I would like to think that if an officer is supporting Blue Lives Matter, don't take me as naive because I don't think that I am at all, but I would like to think that they feel they're doing it for the right reasons. They think that they're just supporting their fellow law enforcement officer. And they don't, on the surface, it might appear that way, but they don't go deep enough to realize that, like you said, it was born in opposition to Black Lives Matter. So for someone to proudly wear their Blue Lives Matter sticker on their car, or a blue line on their mask, they lots of times think that they are doing the right thing. And they may not even be racist. Let me throw that in there. They're just not educated. And that is something that's very important for people to take into consideration.
Now, looking at this picture here and seeing how the police have evolved over the years, do you think there's any way to reform or deconstruct how the police function as a system and socially with Black citizens?
Yes, of course. I think that's a great question, which ties into, when people say defund the police. A lot of times, it comes across because you hear the word fund as we're taking away money from the police or making less officers available, and that's not the case. I think we have to implement more thoughts or more mindfulness around mental health approaches. Possibly, in a lot of the situations I've been stopped in, just to be honest, or racially profiled, I felt like a lot of those situations, you would have one or two cars that would originally make the stop. And if I, as a Black man, contested what that officer was saying, like if he said I was going 50 in a 35, and I said, no, I wasn't. I was going 35 or 37, maybe around 40, but no way I was going 50. What I found out through multiple situations of that happening, and a lot of other people that, I would say people of non-color that don't look like us know, you can ask for a supervisor to attend that stop. And there's always a supervisor in different areas and districts of your city. So those two patrolmen that pulled me over would then call their lieutenant or captain to come supervise their stop and to ensure things were going by the book and how they were supposed to be. I feel like those supervisors, or there should be at least other liaisons in that area, along with those normal patrolmen that are highly trained or detailed in mental health issues. So if I, as a patrolman, pull over or make a stop or arrive to a scene of something that I'm called in, and there's an immediate thought in my head that this person could have some sort of mental health issues, that I immediately call somebody that is going to help me with that situation. That my first thought is not to tase or pull out my gun because this person is irate, dramatic, or not complying or responding to what I'm telling them. The first thought, not first thought, but one of the first things that I should be able to think is this person having a mental health issue? And if we can start to implement more things of whole person, mental health, background, what they're going through, rather than them just being a threat or an intimidating factor when I arrive there, so I need to pull my gun, I think those would help us reform and deconstruct some of the policies that police have in place as a system and socially.
Can I throw something in? This is just something for us all to consider. Police officers are humans, just like we all are, and they watch the news just like we do. And a lot of the narrative that is spread through the news and the newspaper, Facebook, Twitter, other social media avenues, that's what causes us to mistreat each other. And we've had some great programs, even here at this school, where we've brought police officers in to help them understand that all youth are not trouble. And we've introduced the youth to the police officers to help them understand that not all police officers are bad. So to your point, Mr. Murdock, I think that what we really need to do is we need to truly understand where each person comes from, and that we are all individuals. And we have said multiple times on here that all police officers are not bad. And we believe that. We know that to be true. Our hope is that the majority of officers will start to recognize that we are not all criminals, that some Black people are criminals, but so are some white people. And so we just need to be treated as individuals and fairly is what it really boils down to. And I know that that's very elementary, but that's really what it is. We just need to learn to respect each other and understand each other is the point that I want to get out.
And then lastly, just be willing to change. I think, that was one of the things that I took away from interviewing and having our guest, Chief Payson, on one of you guys' last segments, is his ability to say and recognize different areas of his department and what falls under his realm, that it needs to change. I think there's too many police chiefs, commissioners, mayors that aren't willing to go back to the drawing board and say, yes, let's keep this. No, let's change that. Yes, let's keep this. And they're just so stuck in the rut of the norms of what they've used in the past that until now, and we started to uproar after George Floyd's death, and now the charging of Derek Chauvin, that they're starting to realize that we too can change and we too can adapt certain policies and areas of our departments to better fit the needs of our community, more specifically our Black citizens and people of color.
Yeah, but I agree. But I also think that on the other hand, it's also obviously that the officers actually need, like you Hawkins said, that they need to actually experience and be around the students that they could be potentially interacting with. But I also feel like it's on top of holding the officers responsible is creating a system, but also make it a norm that if you commit police brutality and if you are clearly in the wrong, you're going to be punished. You're going to go to jail. Because I feel like a big reason why a lot of officers get a slap on the wrist for committing police brutality is because this system is so used to never actually bringing justice to people who had their lives taken away or who were actually hurt. And I feel like we also need to create a system where the police know if you step out of line or if you're doing something you're not supposed to do, you're going to be punished, and don't think that's okay. Because I feel like that's one thing that makes a lot of officers think they can get away with police brutality.
Yes, well said.
And just now, as we begin to close off this presentation, it just wouldn't be right if we didn't acknowledge a burden virtually all Black people hold when it comes to the police.